All right, let's jump right into this explainer analyzing King Charles III's April 2026 U.S. state visit. And look, this was not just your standard run-of-the-mill ceremonial handshake. Not even close. It was an absolute masterclass in crisis management, one with real implications for global security and international markets. Arriving exactly 250 years after American independence, this visit happened during a profoundly precarious moment for transatlantic relations. So today, we're going to break down exactly how royal soft power was deployed to stabilize what had become a deeply fractured partnership. We'll be navigating through this in 5 quick beats. We're looking at the alliance under duress, the king's defense of democratic resilience, the Blair House Tech Summit, the pomp and policy of the state dinner, and finally, those lingering shadows and future challenges. So, Part 1, an alliance under duress, focusing on this massive geopolitical chasm. To really understand the stakes here, we have to recognize that the special relationship was arguably in its most fractured state since the 1956 Suez Crisis. It was tense. The main flashpoint? The highly contentious 2026 U.S.-led military campaign against Iran. You had Prime Minister Starmer flat out refusing to let U.S. military aircraft use British sovereign bases for offensive missions, and in response, President Trump was threatening some pretty severe tariffs. Add to the mix some fundamental, deep-seated disagreements on climate action and NATO, and well, the king's job was crystal clear. He had to act as the diplomatic glue trying to bridge this massive policy gap. And as if the geopolitical friction wasn't enough, just 48 hours, literally 2 days before the king touched down, a violent security breach hit the White House Correspondents' Dinner. A gunman actually tried to breach the venue, triggering emergency evacuations. As you can imagine, this sparked immediate calls from British lawmakers back home saying, hey, cancel the trip, postpone it, purely because the domestic situation in Washington was so incredibly volatile right then. But he went anyway, moving into Part 2. Defending democratic resilience, and specifically his address to Congress. Instead of pulling the plug after that terrifying security breach, the palace leaned in. Proceeding was a very clear act of solidarity. Becoming only the second British monarch to ever address a joint session of Congress, King Charles went right to the history books, invoking the Magna Carta. He specifically highlighted, and I quote, the principle that executive power is subject to checks and balances. It was such a subtle yet powerful reminder to a very divided Washington about the rule of law and judicial independence. Analysts everywhere saw this as a total masterstroke. He was positioning the monarchy not as this relic of absolute power, but as the historical guardian of the very constitutional traditions that restrict it. He systematically reinforced Western liberal democracy up there, and he didn't shy away from delivering some hard truths. When it came to NATO, an alliance the U.S. administration had been pretty vocal about criticizing, he reminded lawmakers that Article 5 has only ever been invoked once, and that was to defend the United States after 9/11. He masterfully used that shared history to urge continued support for Ukraine. He also went hard on climate action, warning about collapsing natural systems and smartly framing conservation as an absolute national security imperative. He cautioned against American isolationism and, bringing it back to the bottom line, reminded everyone about the $430 billion in mutual trade. I mean, $430 billion, that is a massive economic anchor binding these two nations together. All right, shifting gears to Part 3, the Blair House Tech Summit and a pivot to economic diplomacy. Stepping away from Capitol Hill, the king hosted absolute heavyweights from Silicon Valley at Blair House. We're talking Apple's Tim Cook, Amazon's Jeff Bezos, to push a highly coordinated 3-pronged economic agenda. Step 1 was AI governance, really advocating for international guardrails to protect social cohesion. Step 2 homed in on the startup ecosystem, aiming to secure serious funding for sustainable tech and green innovation. And Step 3 was all about British investment, pitching London as the ultimate gateway to European and Commonwealth markets. It's fascinating because he essentially used the Crown's prestige to facilitate this vital dialogue between the UK's digital ambitions and the biggest tech players in the US. Next up, Part 4, State Dinner Pomp and Policy, what you might call the diplomatic climax. The White House Eastern State Dinner was this incredible synthesis of aesthetic grandeur and razor-sharp diplomatic messaging. Honestly, even the menu was doing heavy lifting. The White House chefs deliberately blended American spring ingredients with these highly formal French preparations. We had a garden vegetable velouté, followed by a classic Dover sole meunière. Food critics were quick to point out that this specific culinary style was a direct throwback to the settled diplomacy of the Eisenhower era, back when Queen Elizabeth II made her first visit. And for dessert? a beehive-shaped chocolate gâteau made with actual honey from the White House hives. Just a perfectly personalized nod to the king and queen's well-known passion for beekeeping. But the real showstopper of the night was the gift exchange. King Charles presented President Trump with an original bell from the HMS Trump, which was a Royal Navy submarine launched way back in 1944. Now, the ship's name was totally a historical coincidence, but it gave the king the perfect setup to blend military history with a bit of contemporary humor. He actually quipped, "Should you ever need to get hold of us, just give us a ring." It was lighthearted, sure, but it smoothly reinforced the deep, long-standing military and intelligence cooperation between the two countries. And the king kept that masterful humor rolling during his formal toast, using it to disarm the tension in the room while dropping some historical facts. Responding to the president's frequent remarks about rescuing Europe in the past, the king fired back with an absolute zinger, saying, "Dare I say that if it wasn't for us, you'd be speaking French." Oh, and he even joked about the British burning down the White House in 1814, calling it a small attempt at real estate redevelopment. Truly a masterclass in using charm to navigate some incredibly tense geopolitical realities. On the flip side, President Trump took a very different approach with his toast. He offered a full-throated defense of British colonialism, suggesting that the colonies were given a great gift of law and liberty. For political observers, this was fascinating because it aligned the special relationship squarely with his America First platform, providing a pretty stark contrast to the king's earlier focus on shared modern democratic traditions. You also have to look at the 150-person guest list because it was basically a map of power in Washington at that exact moment. It leaned heavily toward the administration's political, judicial, and media allies. For instance, all 6 conservative Supreme Court justices were there, while the liberal wing was notably absent. That dynamic starkly highlighted the deep domestic polarization the king was walking right into, especially when you compare it to the very bipartisan reception he received over at Congress earlier that same day. Finally, Part 5, Shadows and Future Challenges. Because let's be real, deep-seated issues don't just vanish overnight. One of the most prominent shadows hanging over the trip was the ongoing controversies surrounding Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein. Advocacy groups had been pushing hard, urging the king to meet with Epstein survivors while in the U.S. And while no public meeting happened, the king did subtly reference the need to support victims during his congressional speech. A palace aide later confirmed this wasn't an accident. It was a highly intentional, indirect acknowledgement of the controversy, attempting to balance public accountability without crossing into commentary on ongoing police investigations. Looking ahead, there are still massive, critical challenges that impact global markets and security. The intense disagreements over the Iran war definitely persist. The looming threat of universal trade levies, that remains a massive risk, not just for the British economy, but for global supply chains that affect everyday consumers. Plus, the broader debate over the crown's credibility continues to simmer. Is it a constructive force for human rights or just a vestige of the past? Those questions were right there, bubbling just beneath the surface of all the diplomatic pageantry. Ultimately, the king stepped in and successfully provided a vital floor to a relationship that was in real danger of spiraling into permanent hostility. But it leaves us with a huge question to ponder. In an era of volatile, multipolar geopolitics, can the traditional soft power of the monarchy truly continue to hold the line when political leadership deeply fractures? This state visit proved that royal diplomacy still has immense utility, but it also laid bare its limits. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.